Stand by, we're about to begin. As a reminder, today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Chris Slack. Please go ahead, sir.
Hey, thank you so much, Amber, and welcome everybody in our audience to today's webcast, Best Practices in Server Migrations, P2V, V2P, P2C, and V2C, new techniques in using backups to ensure IT service delivery, sponsored by AppAssure. I'm Chris Slack with Redmond Magazine, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's event, so thank you all for joining us for today's webcast. Just a few quick things for those of you in the audience before we get started today. You'll notice down at the bottom of your screen you have a new doc for those of you that are familiar with our system. Please feel free to use all the features of that doc. From down there, you'll be able to find your resource list where you could download slides, get some links, and share some information. Also there, you'll see a Ask a Question box on the left-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to use that box and ask us a question anytime you see fit. And hopefully at the end of today's webcast, we'll get to everybody's questions and supply some answers. Also, today's webcast is being recorded for future viewing and listening purposes, and we'll send you a link to the email you registered with within 24 to 48 hours after today's webcast, and feel free to share that link with other people so they could register and watch the webcast too. But joining us for today's webcast, we have two great presenters. Coming up later in the webcast, Joe Hand. He is a VMware VTSP. He is also Senior Director of Product Strategy at AppAssure. He'll join us in the second part of today's webcast. But first up today, we have Greg Shields. He is Principal Technologist and Senior Partner at Concentrated Tech, and you could get more information at concentratedtech.com. But Greg is also a Microsoft MVP, and he's a noted author, and he's also a noted webcast host of many webcasts such as this. And with that, I'm going to hand over today's webcast to Greg so that way he can get us started. So Greg, why don't you take the floor?
Chris, thank you. Thanks to all of you, too, for taking some time out of the beginning of your day. For, what I think is possibly the longest webcast title that I think I've done in all of these that I've put together. You know, you think of those server migrations, right? you got to go from physical to virtual. You got to go from virtual to cloud these days, right? And sometimes you got to go backwards too. You got to go from virtual back to physical, or I don't even think I put it on here, but virtual back to physical or cloud back to physical in some cases. And so all of these different types of server migrations kind of, they kind of serve to really complicate the problem in terms of how we have to get the different formats for all of our different server workloads transferred between the physical world, the virtual world, and then the cloud-enabled world. I don't know, call it what to what, or X to X, or whatever. The whole concept here is about conversions, right? And this process is, this process is one that it wasn't that many years ago when we were talking about P2V and how cool P2V was. And in a very short period of time, this whole conversion thing has grown to almost kind of take over a lot of the activities that are going on in our very heterogeneous environments. So a couple of years ago, right, we introduced virtualization. We started realizing that we needed to get these physical computers into the virtual world. And so we created these tools called P2V tools that they kind of automated that entire process of taking a physical computer and turning it into a virtual computer. Now, some of those early P2V tools, as I think you probably know, really no more than ghost and then a driver change. And so we kind of ghost the machine into some image format, and then we change around the driver so it fits into whatever platform, whatever virtual platform we need to put that machine into, and then voila, we have a virtual computer that we've created from that original physical host. Well, as time has evolved, our needs have evolved with it. And so the needs to get physical computers into virtual computers, or virtual computers of one format into virtual computers of a completely different format, or now getting physical or virtual computers up into the cloud, because the cloud formats in some cases are different than what we would have in our on-premise environments, or even going backwards. So all of these different conversions are becoming very important to us as we realize that we need to right-size the hosting platform for our different server workloads. Some make sense in the physical world, some make sense in the virtual world, and we're realizing now that some make sense in the cloud world. And if we make a mistake or if our needs evolve, we need to make that conversion. Now, what's interesting is that the tools that are out there, right, there are actually quite a few tools that are available today for performing a lot of these format conversions, the X to X format conversions. And if you kind of took a 1,000-foot perspective view of those tools, you would think that it requires a whole quiver of them. I mean, what are the ones we have, right? So VMware's got its VMware Converter tool, and Microsoft inside of System Center VMM has their tool to go, in their direction. And then we have some third-party tools as well, like Quest has a tool, vConverter, Platespin now, Novell has this Migrate tool. Some of the cloud tools are out there too, right? So Amazon's got its own VM import connector thing that takes your virtual machines and puts them in Amazon's format. And even some of the other tools, some of the maybe not necessarily the first party, but the third parties that are out there, like Cloud Sigma, are providing other solutions that are out there. Goodness gracious, there's a whole quiver of tools that are required in order to support these needs. Now, what's interesting, though, is that while the first part, so the first limitation of these tools is that they're fairly platform specific, right? And so if I use a VMware converter, I'm going to be able to convert a physical machine into a VMware environment, but VMware is not going to provide any kind of functionality that allows me to get into a Microsoft environment or an Amazon environment. Also, these tools that are out there are not really universal in scope. So you look at a VMware converter, right? It's a free tool. I can go to a website and I can download the VMware Converter tool, and it's a little nice free solution that allows me to do conversions. But VMware's got this vested interest in getting you onto their platform, so they're going to get you in one direction, but they're probably not going to get you in the other direction. Right? Same thing with Amazon. Amazon wants to get you into their cloud format, but they're not going to necessarily help you in getting back out of it. So a lot of the tools are designed based on these sort of extra circumstances that the platform vendors are trying to get you into their platform. There are, with some of these other tools, the third-party kind of more universal type tools, the abilities to go backwards, but really none of these tools, if you look at the graph here on the screen, are really truly universal in scope. So that's kind of the first problem. Now the second problem, too, is that the whole concept of conversions is an activity that in many ways the industry's they pay attention to it because they want to get you into their format, but there's just not a lot of business there. And so you'll find that many of those tools are fairly platform specific, just like I mentioned. And the ones that may not be platform specific, if you kind of look underneath the covers, these tools look like they're maybe not getting as much attention as they used to. And so they're not necessarily deprecated. They're not necessarily tools that are no longer being supported, but they're tools that are just not getting the level of attention that they used to. So, okay, we still have this activity, and we still have things that we need to do in order to get our physical machines into the virtual world and our virtual machines into the physical world, and all these different conversions that are necessary in a heterogeneous environment. And all of these limitations kind of makes you begin to wonder, well, all right, is this whole conversion activity becoming a dying requirement? Probably not. I mean, you're here on this webinar because you probably had the need to do some migrations, and you're looking for a way to be able to do those migrations in a very easy, automated, universal sense. So we can't argue that it's becoming a dying requirement. Well, maybe it's just one that requires platform tools. Okay, if I want to go onto a VMware platform, I've just got to trust VMware to get me in that direction. Well, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, we have these third-party solutions that can do kind of universal things, so it's not a requirement that it uses platform tools. Well, maybe this whole activity is just doomed to become an administrative nightmare. Okay, maybe we're forced to suffer in this world where the free tools allow us to go in one direction, but there's really no solutions that are out there that can do just everything all the time. So these are kind of the consequences that are out there. Now, all of this kind of makes you wonder. So I can't find anything that's universal. The tools that are available are kind of these wags from these platform vendors because they want to get me onto their platform. Is it possibly the case that I'm just thinking about this whole conversion activity in the wrong way? Right? The notion of a P2V tool, in any of its various iterations is fairly VM-centric in nature, right? The tools that you use today to go from physical to virtual are they think about the outside edges of that virtual machine more so than they do the contents inside that virtual machine. So maybe we're kind of going about this entire process in just the wrong way. There's a word I like to use to describe this, and that word is orthogonal. And there's a mathematical definition for what orthogonal means, but the kind of the social definition is, in general use, orthogonal defines a characteristic of two items that are non-redundant, non-overlapping, or just simply irrelevant. So the tools that are out there, the conversion tools that exist, are in many ways orthogonal to the problems that you're actually having. Your problems are not being met by these tools, and so something else is actually the answer. So the question then is, all right, well, is the whole concept of an X to X or P2V or whatever, is the whole concept of that kind of a product actually orthogonal to the problem that you're having? Here's the argument. So let's think about a different approach. Okay, so rather than focusing on that, the outside edges, the virtual chassis, if you will, that those machines are, let's think about what's inside. Okay, might a better solution be, first of all, something that's universal? And I want to be able to go from whatever to whatever, and in any kind of format, and in fact, a solution that doesn't care what the first letter is in front of the two, or what the second letter is behind the two. It's anything to anything, and that's just the way it's been architected from the ground up. Number two, that doesn't necessarily a solution that doesn't necessarily consider itself a conversion solution. So if we think, well, okay, that what we're interested in is not the fact that we're converting one virtual format or physical format to another, but the contents inside that machine. Well, what we're looking for is a data recovery tool more so than any kind of conversion tool, right? Data recovery would focus on the contents of the virtual machine and not necessarily those things that are sitting outside. Now, the third thing here is that, all right, we want to focus on the contents, and content-centric is really what this should say instead of VM-centric, and not platform-centric. So all of this really kind of defines that what we're looking for is something that allows us to convert from any format to any format indiscriminately, regardless of hypervisor, regardless of virtual disk format, regardless of platform, because the solution is more interested in the data than is it the platform itself. So really, if you think about this, the fault here is, in many ways, the backup solutions that we have. So let's think about the backup solutions that exist today. Okay, here, as you can see on the screen, we have kind of a stacked diagram that shows your typical virtual environment. At the bottom, I've got storage. I've got a volume subsystem that exists on that storage. I've got some sort of management operating system in the VMware world that is a kind of Linux-ish management OS, in the Microsoft world that is a Windows-ish OS. I've got some kind of hypervisor, and then I've got some virtual machines that sit on top. A classic stacked diagram for how we describe virtualization. So in that stack diagram, think about the different options that you have at your fingertips for backing up those virtual machines. Okay, the first one you can probably immediately think of is, all right, there are all these virtual aware backup solutions that are out there. But in many ways, those virtual aware backup solutions kind of sit down in that management OS. They have to talk at almost the hypervisor level and look up into the virtual machines in order to grab their virtual machine disk files and throw them back onto disk. Now, this is probably a great thing if you're looking to, restore that whole virtual machine disk file, but there are also some challenges there because, well, if I restore the virtual machine disk file, I'm going to restore it in exactly the same state it was. So converting it still has a conversion mentality and not a data recovery mentality. Another option is to throw that backup agent way back into the storage. Down there in the storage, I can also look up at those virtual machine disk files. I maybe have some better performance. I have to really do some better quiescence. I have to do some better, orchestration between the hypervisor and the virtual machines and the things inside the virtual machine there. So I'm not really gaining too much other than a little bit of performance by moving that back into the storage. There are also other options as well. And some of these options may in fact look very similar to the ones that we've used for decades for the physical items that we've had in our data center. One such solution is the volume subsystem filter. Okay, this is a solution that's been really getting a lot of steam these days, really been getting a lot of motivation, really a lot of attention in the industry, because it takes the same sort of approach that the old backup solutions have for decades, for years and years and years, but it kind of elevates the layer of abstraction away from looking at files and folders, and instead looking at the individual blocks on disk. Okay, how does this work? So I've got a server, okay, and I don't care if it's a virtual server, a physical server, a cloud server. It doesn't matter at all. It's just a server that's running some sort of workload. And under number 1 there, when the server makes a change to a block on disk, right, it flips a 0 to a 1, well, that change has to go through a number of layers. So switching down to number 2, you can see those layers that exist there. When that server makes the change, some application talks to an operating system file API that ultimately talks to some physical storage to flip that 0 to a 1. Well, if we take a nice little agent and shim that agent between all those conversations, we can take a look and watch whenever those bits get changed. When those bits get changed, that agent can then notify the backup server, as down here on number 3, that, okay, well, that block of data has flipped from a 0 to a 1. And so the backup server ends up becoming this really long catalog, if you will, of all the individual changes that occur on that server. And restoring that server becomes nothing more than sort of just laying out those changes in time-aligned order right back onto whatever computer that exists. So this is interesting because what this solution provides from the conversion story is a mechanism to replay all of this data right back onto that machine, whether it's a cloud-enabled machine, whether it's sitting in Amazon, whether it's a physical computer, whether it's a virtual machine. If I have the right drivers that exist for this machine, it's really no different than running a ghost and injecting that image right back onto that replacement computer, physical, virtual, cloud, or any of the above. And so really the solution you're looking for in a conversion tool is not really a conversion tool at all. It's really a data protection solution. That kind of data protection solution gives you all kinds of different benefits. Right? You're not limited to just doing conversions. Right? If I can collect all that data in a block-by-block format, focusing on those disk blocks, well then I really kind of treat all the different kinds of data more or less the same, whether it's a file or a folder or an entire virtual machine, an entire physical machine, an application object, an application itself. It doesn't matter. It's just the data. Right? And the gathering of that data makes the whole restoration really easy and really quickly restorable. If I have this nice time-aligned series of changes to blocks on disk, well, I can go to more or less any time period when that occurred and roll my server forwards and backwards in time to any point in the past. And also, because I'm constantly gathering this stuff, I don't really have backups anymore, right? Because my machines are constantly, continuously backing themselves up. I don't really have this notion of daily backups. The whole performance problem is eliminated too, right? You think about, all right, so at the end of the day, we light up the backups, and then all the processors have to do their work in figuring out what changed and then transferring everything as fast as possible onto disk. Well, all that, there's a real impact on performance, and particularly so in the virtual environment. So if I'm constantly trickling all those changes off to that backup server, well, I really have no impact or very, very little impact on VM performance. That allows me to scale with the number of virtual machines per host and the number of virtual machines in my cloud environment really with as much as I want to. So what you're really looking for when you're seeking out a conversion solution is not that conversion solution. You're looking for one that cares not necessarily about the platform, but about the content, what's inside that virtual machine. So hopefully this has given you at least something to think about how you might kind of just adjust your whole approach towards doing conversions. And that while there are tools out there, those tools can be kind of platform dependent. And where the solution that really will solve all of your problems, whether they be physical, virtual, or cloud, might be something more like a data protection solution. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Joe, who's going to talk about a data protection solution that can do exactly that. Joe?
Thanks, Greg. So, as Chris said earlier, and thank you, Chris, for the introductions, my name is Joseph Hand. I am the Senior Director of Product Strategy at AppAssure. Just going to take you through a couple slides and leave plenty of time for Q&A. So feel free to type questions in. We'll get to them and make sure everybody goes home happy. So why migrate? That's the real crux of the matter, right? So why do I want to migrate my data, whether it's, from one platform to another? In most cases, we're either migrating from physical to virtual, or from physical to cloud, or from virtual to cloud, or, again, as Greg said, earlier, occasionally you might even migrate back into a physical, depending on the type of scenario you're in. Right? But why do we do it? We take a better advantage of resources, right? If you look at, a typical physical machine that's running a mainstream line of business application, most of the time you've got a tremendous amount of storage allocated on that box, and you're using less than half of it. Most of the time you've got some pretty beefy processors, and you're using 10% on average, right? Memory, same thing. You're stacking it up, and you're seeing that your utilization is under half, right? Under a third, even under a quarter, right? So if I virtualize and I put multiple instances onto this one piece of hardware, and I monitor it, obviously, I don't want to overload the thing, but I can take advantage of all of those system resources. So that's a great reason to migrate. There's also the whole concept of, the floor space, all right? So if I have 100 servers and I've taken that 100 and migrated them down to 5, right, I'm saving on power, cooling management, all of the day-to-day stuff that keeps that server running, right? From a financial perspective, you're using more of your existing, and you're saving money. You don't have to buy as much hardware, and if you're going to the cloud, you don't have to buy any, really. You don't have to maintain it either, right, which is another major cost factor in just about any data center, right? And then, there's always the feel-good reasons, right? And this is why we are now buying the Priuses of the world. We want to go green. We want to do something for the environment. And migrating to a virtual or a cloud platform is really one way to do that very well. So if you look at your typical legacy backup tool, right, this is a backup product that may have been on the market for the last 10, 20, even 30 years. Right? They do backup and recovery, and some of them do it well. They're traditionally file-based, right, which simply means, when a file is flagged as changed through its, archive bit, the backup process runs, scans through the entire disk, and says, okay, here's all the files that have changed. And the reason why we've created the whole concept of a backup window is because that process is extremely invasive on a server, right? It's probably not retrofitted for virtual in a way that actually takes advantage of the platforms, right? These are products, again, that have been in motion for a number of years before virtual was even conceived, right? Then there's migration tools. Migration tools, other than the very specific platform one, can be very expensive. And what do you use them for? You use them for, a small period of time, and that's it. So you've spent a lot of money. You've had to, learn a very complex process. I'm sure that, doesn't take a single day, right? And then you discard it. You're done. Your migration is complete. AppAssure backup and replication, right? So, as indicated, this whole concept of X to X is built right in. We can do a seamless migration from whatever platform you were on to whatever platform you want to go to as part of backup and recovery, right? So if I'm capturing data, first of all, the way I do it in our product is pretty simple and straightforward. I'm getting block level changes from the volume subsystem. All right, so we're not plagued with, the typical open file issues. We don't leave anything out, right? We're utilizing, the whole VSS engine to make sure we get clean, crisp, quiesced copies of everything, right? From the Windows components to the applications to the volume blocks, anything and everything. All right, so we're backing that up. Now, we use a feature called change block tracking. Change block tracking, it's actually something that's relatively new on like the VMware side. It doesn't really exist anyplace else. We've been doing it since 2006. And what it means is when, let's say we have a snapshot scheduled for noon, and our next snapshot after that is 12:10, right? Any change that happens between noon and 12:10 gets written on the block map. When it's time for me to go in at 12:10 and do the next snapshot, I don't have to spin the disk and read through its entire contents. I simply go to the map and say what blocks have changed. Now, our drivers are optimized to actually, capture that data, drop it through the network interface, and not really do any additional processing that we can do on the AppAssure server, right? So the side effect is we use, on average during a snapshot, anywhere from 0 to 3% of the CPU. And a snapshot literally can take seconds. And that gives you that freedom to do this all day long without, having the concept of a backup window, without impacting the environment. Right? So, we can do the migration. I'm going to get into how we do that in just a couple of minutes. But there's a lot more, right? There's the whole concept of, a near zero recovery time objective. We have a feature we call live recovery. Live recovery enables us to literally go in and stand up a volume or multiple volumes, regardless of their size, in seconds. And we do that by giving you the ability to access that data. We start a restore, we put back the metadata, the driver that sits on that host will act as an interceptor of any requests. So if a user goes in and says, I need this email, I need this calendar item, I need this query from a SQL server, I need this file from a file share, it doesn't matter where the request is coming from. Eventually it says to this driver, I'm looking for block number X. The driver is smart enough to look at the local volume and see if that block's been recovered yet. If it has, it passes it through. If not, it goes back over to the AppAssure core server and puts that block at the head of the priority list, where it then shoots back and is served up. So to the end users, the moment your restore begins, they're back to work. There really isn't any product on the planet that can do that today. We can leverage that one feature with creating a virtual machine, whether it was originally virtual or not, doing bare metal recoveries even to dissimilar hardware. So if I had to just simply create the OS volume using either bare metal or the VM creation wizard, and the typical OS volume is, if you follow that concept of Microsoft best practices, 20 to 25, maybe 30 gigs at the outside with the operating system, the application, and the 48 million patches from Microsoft. Well, I can have that stood up in minutes, and then when I begin my restore of my data volumes, which might be a gigabyte, might be a terabyte, might be a petabyte, none of that matters. They're up. 5-minute RPO, that's because we can snap as frequently as every 5 minutes, so you don't lose data. If you're using legacy tools today for backup, you're basically running a backup once per night, giving you an RPO of 24 hours. Can you afford to lose an entire day? That's really what it comes down to. Is your data important? fail over to a VM locally or remotely. Now, this is where we start to cross into the ability to do migrations. Okay? So I have either a physical or a virtual machine. That machine is being backed up. That machine fails, whatever the reason. I can have a pre-built copy that is constantly receiving those block level changes so that it is up to date, ready to go, either locally or in the remote site or both. The remote site could be in your basement, could be in a colo facility, could be in another building, could be in the cloud. Doesn't matter. Right? Recovery Assure, this is one of the key 3 technologies in AppAssure. This basically gives you, without going into a ton of detail, 100% reliable backups. Right? How many times have you gone into a restore scenario, either carrying a prayer book or maybe a small animal to sacrifice, in hopes maybe the copy of your resume being updated while the restore is going on, because you just don't know. And some companies invest literally tens of thousands of dollars into going through a process that's completely manual, very costly, of randomly selecting the occasional backup and restoring it to make sure it works. Well, maybe that one does. But how does that tell you whether or not the current one will work? Recovery Assure, for the most part, looks at the volume, runs check disk on it, looks at the databases, whether they're SQL or Exchange, and either mounts or attaches these things. And based on this type of testing, we can give you a little green check mark next to the backup that says, hey, this thing is good. And then there's granular everything, right? And realistically, it is very simple to use every component within the granular. You want to get a file back, you're using Windows Explorer. You want to get an email back, you're right-clicking a point in time, opening a database, and about 30 seconds later, you're ready to do your restore, and you're restoring messages, you're restoring items. Same thing with SharePoint. Right? All kinds of fun, interesting ways to do that. There's a single management console that gives you a view into everything. Very simple. Right? I have green lights up and down the console. I know everything is healthy. Exporting a machine, right, whether it's physical or virtual, is as simple as right-clicking a point in time and choosing Create Virtual Machine. Right? Everything is wizard-driven. We support today, to create a virtual machine, we support Hyper-V and VMware. If you choose a VMware platform, we're going to go right through the vStorage APIs, and we're going to create the machine directly into a data store and a resource pool, giving you all of the traditional options like thin provisioning, things like that. The interesting thing about this is continuous mode. Continuous mode is what we talked about before, where I have that machine pre-built. Now let's talk about using this for migration. Right? We covered most of this. This is, all the functionality in terms of, what you're doing when you're exporting, right? So let's say, for instance, you had a migration this weekend that you wanted to make it through, right? We have our agents deployed. We're backing up your machines. Whether, again, they're physical going to virtual, virtual going to cloud, virtual going to physical. We're going to back up this machine, and we're going to have our initial full and all of our incrementals, whatever frequency you set. So on, let's say, Monday morning we come in, we'll create the virtual standbys in continuous mode. Now, if it's a large server, it doesn't get built in a half an hour, right? So give yourself a couple of days, and it's going to catch up and eventually get in sync. So the only real work you're doing is creating the VM standbys, pointing them at a specific location where they'll be built. Tuesday, kick back. All right. Friday night comes. Wait until the end of the evening. Kick the users off. All right. Shut down your production machine, whether it was physical or virtual. Go over to your virtual console and power on the VM standbys. Verify connectivity. You're done. They're clones. They even already have the backup agent in them. The software will then come online and basically say, oh, you're back. Let me continue to back you up. It's really that simple. Anything like from going into one of the virtual platforms, all of the necessary drivers to be able to boot that thing are automatically slipstreamed in. For VMware, you're going to want to obviously install the VMware tools. That way you can better take advantage of the VMware hardware integration. But that's basically it. Recovery Assure, again, you get these green check marks, everything is good. Live recovery, very simple. You create your restore job, and about 30 to 45 seconds in, your users are back to work. You can combine it with the VM creation wizard and the bare metal restore to get whole servers up in minutes. Universal recovery, right? So when I do my backups, I have a complete image. I can recover them as whole systems or VMs. Then I have the ability of going inside those images and pulling out any of the data. And I don't have to first build an entire virtual infrastructure to be able to do that, because the image to us is wide open. Same thing like with with Exchange. We understand the concept of an EDB file. We have the API to go inside that EDB file and present it to you in a interface that looks just like any mail client, and allow you to scroll through the mailboxes, take whatever it is you need, and put it back. Same thing with SharePoint. Right? We can go into a config database and any number of content databases, and we can restore data, no matter what it is, preserving everything, workflows, versioning, you name it. You talk about, from AppAssure, from a growth perspective, Inc. 500's analysis, 3,450% growth in 3 years. That's in a market that's growing at 4 to 6% annually. There's a reason we're doing this, and that is because we are actually solving the problems. We are also listed as the 7th fastest growing software company. That's out of all software companies, not just in the storage, backup, recovery sector. Over 6,000 customers. Actually, my partners number is off. We're about 1,200 partners now that can actually go in and assist you in implementing this solution. Awards, right? So, we need, obviously, any company that creates a product that is going to solve real problems is going to get noticed in the industry. All right, our most recent, all the way to the left there, virtualization review, best disaster recovery. The next two over, 2 gold stars from Windows IT Pro. This was at the tail end of 2011. All right, so this is, best backup and recovery, best disaster recovery. And the list goes on. From a customer perspective, It literally is anything from two Neds in a shed on up to some of the world's largest companies. Right? We've got, one company that does exchange hosting, and they're hosting somewhere north of 800,000 mailboxes, and they are using AppAssure to make sure those exchange servers are able to be restored, and they'll be able to retrieve individual user data instantly. So at this point, I'd like to maybe hand it back on over to Chris, and let's open it up for questions.
Hey, thank you so much, Joe. Much appreciated. Great presentation. So for those of you in the audience, if you do have a question, please feel free to enter it in the Ask a Question box. It'll be right there on the left-hand side of your console. If not, you could select it from your dock. Just feel free to type in your questions and hit submit, and they will be sent off to myself, Joe, and Greg, and we'll be here to answer your questions. Just briefly, I'll push the slide out there for you. So for more information on anything mentioned here today about AppAssure, you could go to the website at AppAssure.com. For sales and pricing information, you could go there as well, or you could contact sales@AppAssure.com. Also, you'll see other information on how you could reach them on Twitter, Facebook, and you could also go about reading their blog. But if you do have a question at this time, please feel free to submit it, and we'll get to it. We'll get to it in the Q&A session now. The first question that I saw come in earlier in the webcast is when you first started, Joe. It was regarding the change block tracking. Is there any limit to how long or how short you could set your intervals for that?
The interval setting is actually as long as 2 weeks and as short as every 5 minutes. 5 minutes gives you 288 backups per day.
Okay, great. One question here that came in about the continuous mode. Is there any benefit over that, over choosing that method rather than doing it manually with something like the change block tracking? Do you see any benefit? And maybe if you could expand a little bit on the continuous mode.
Sure. Continuous mode is basically, we have the ability of creating a VM. The VM creation is separate and apart from the actual backup. Right? So when I do a backup, I'm doing it, on whatever interval I've set. Let's say it's every 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, I'm doing another backup. Each individual snapshot, when needed, can actually be the entire image. It's done with a virtual disk driver. It's presented immediately when you need it. It doesn't have to go through a reclamation process or anything like that, or synthetic fulls. It's always there, right? It's always ready to go. That is separate from the VM creation, where I want to have this virtual standby, so I create the VM, right? And that's to be able to stand it up at any point in time, right? So I can do it in single mode and just create a server. All right, maybe I need a server for testing. Microsoft comes out with a new service pack for Exchange, and I'm actually petrified to install it. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just create a copy of my Exchange server, isolate it off of the network, install the service pack, and see how it goes. All right, continuous mode is now the ability to say, every time I take a snapshot of my production machine, let me take those block level changes and write those to the offline VMDK or VHD disk files that I've created with my initial standby creation. All right, so now I'm constantly updating this with those block level changes. Again, the two, right, the repository and the VM standby are two totally separate things.
You had a question here. How long are the snapshots stored? Let's say somebody wanted to go back a couple months and grab something. Would they have the ability to do that?
So it's literally as long as you want to keep it, right? So we have a retention engine that's built in. So with that retention engine, I can set it to take. It really depends on the server, right? So let's say, for instance, I have a file share, right? The file share, I back it up. Let's say I'm backing it up every 15 minutes, 96 times per day. Those individual snapshots have a shelf life of usefulness, right? And it's pretty short, because the reality is once I take the next one, the previous one, the usefulness of it drops like a stone, right? Do I need that uber level? Because when a user calls me at the help desk and says, hey, I accidentally deleted this file, he'll probably remember maybe about what time of day it was. An hourly is probably sufficient for that, right? So what I'll do is I'll save my 15-minute snaps for a day, and then I'll condense them down into hourlies. Maybe I'll hold on to my hourlies for, a few more days, because again, that within that week, the user probably has the ability of remembering about what time of day. Maybe it was right after lunch, so it was around 1 o'clock, right? After another user-definable period of time, I'll take those hourlies and I'll smush those down into dailies. And then I'll keep my dailies for X number of days. And again, apply the same, line of thinking based on the type of machine it is. I'll take my dailies, move them into weeklies, take my weeklies, move them into monthlies. So this process called roll-up will actually condense as it goes, so you're not actually storing all of these individual snaps, right? Now when I get to monthlies, I set that for as long as I need to keep my data. All right, so now let's talk about storage. For about a month's worth of snapshots, we usually need about 1.2x. For a full year, we usually fit somewhere in about 2x. And these are overreaching numbers based on the fact that, we don't want somebody to run out of space, right? But you can usually see a lot better than that even.
Got a question here for you, Joe. This is from Dave in the audience. He's asking, do you support all the OSs? Do you support all OSs that VMware and Hyper-V support?
No, we do not. Today, AppAssure supports only Windows, and specifically only versions of Windows that support Microsoft VSF. So that's on the server side, it's Windows 2003 and 2008, any of the versions. Windows XP, SP3, Vista, and 7 on the desktop. We are going to be supporting Linux probably sometime in Q2.
That's excellent. We got a question here from you, from an audience member. It's two questions in one, so just bear with me while I read it. How much additional disk space in percentage should they have for backups of, start reading this again. How much additional disk space in percentage should they have for backups, and how much new hardware do you think they would need to acquire or replace for an existing tape library?
So as far as how much disk space, it really depends on, the type of data. Right, so if it's like a database of any kind, we typically see a tremendous amount of compression, for SQL, for anything really on the database side. For Exchange and file shares, we get an average of about 65-70% compression deduplication ratio. Right, so as far as how much goes, again, the guideline is about 1.2x. For the month and about 2x for a year, and that doesn't include that only includes the repository. That does not include virtual standby, which is a 1-for-1 on top of what's on the repository side.
All right, great. Thanks, Joe. It seems we're going to hit the top of the hour here for this webcast, and we seem to run out of questions in the Q&A. So for those of you who didn't get to ask your question now, please feel free to look at the information there on the slide that's currently on your screen. Like I said, for more information on sales and pricing, you can contact sales at AppAssure.com or visit their website at AppAssure.com. And you can find all the other information there for their Twitter accounts, their Facebooks, and their blogs. And you can get more information there as well. I'd like to thank Joe and Greg for joining us today and sharing their presentations. So thank you, gentlemen, thank you two gentlemen so much. And also, I think we'd like to extend a big thank you for all of you for joining us for today's webcast, which has been sponsored by AppAssure. Once again, I'm Chris Flack with Redmond Magazine and Virtualization Review. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webcast, and we hope you have a great day.